Hello, and welcome to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you today, Bill?
I'm feeling like the European theater of operations today, Seth. I'm ready to get on with it.
Indeed, indeed. And joining us, as he has with all of these reviews of Masters of the Air, is director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, my good buddy, Tommy Lofton. How are you, Tommy, on this March day?
I'm good, guys. How are y'all?
Not too shabby. Been busy, shall we say? Been very, very busy. Well, Bill, I am handing it over to you. Go with it.
Okay, and we'll start as we always do with spoiler alerts. There's a lot of spoiler alerts. If you haven't seen part eight, what do we call it? Episode eight
Episode
of
eight.
Masters of the Air yet? Yeah, so don't listen to this. Go watch the episode and then come back and see if you agree with us. That's going to be the interesting thing. So, outskirts of Rome, June 1, 1944. Something happens in a few days. If this is June the 1st, I can't think of what it is. And so they say they cut us to the 15th Air Force in Italy and the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Guys, there's something different about the 99th Pursuit Squadron during World War II. What would that be?
Well, they were all African American. These guys are a portion of what is later going to be widely known, even though they weren't called that at that time, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group.
And
And
they
noticeably,
but
they're
the
flying
airplanes.
P-40s at this time too.
Yes.
Yeah, P-40s, not yet the P-51s. But the airplane still had a unique kind of paint scheme, didn't it?
It did. And I got to
Oh,
be honest with you. I'm not sure if that is accurate for the 15th Air Force and P-40s. As a matter of fact, I know it's not because not every P-40 that took to the air had a shark's mouth on the front of it.
correct. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
something that a few individuals, and there's a few photographs of guys in the 99th Pursuit Squadron or Fighter Squadron that um, you see that pattern on, but there's quite a few where you don't. That's not a common thing. It's not every single aircraft. I'm sure they just copied and pasted for the show and in preparation for all of this. Plus, by the time they get into June of 44, I don't even think they're flying P-40s anymore historically. I think they're all flying the Mustang. I may be wrong on that,
Yeah,
um, but I remember, and it's not even, of course, we've talked about this before too. The Mustangs they show in the series are all D models, and I don't think they were flying anything but C's in the June time frame of 44. I think it was until July or August maybe that they
Mhm.
started getting D's, but doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah, well,
But in
they're
the
going to
show,
talk later about the transition from at this. The way they're talking now is they're still in the P-40s, and they're
yeah.
admiring the possibility that they might someday be flying P-51s. So that's not accurate. They all have the red tail paint scheme. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not,
It
but
is.
as you said,
It is.
it is okay. But all of them have this little shark teeth kind of thing on the front of the airplane. They build one airplane model in the computer and then they mimic it, repeat it, clone it 400 times or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's a whole lot less work. But the other interesting thing about this episode is that normally they'll do 5 minutes of exposition and then the title sequence.
Right.
And this one, I don't think they've done, maybe sometimes as much as 10 minutes of exposition. And you're really well into the story before the title sequence and the music begins. In this case, it's title sequence almost immediately. It's maybe 30 seconds, a minute of exposition, and they're into the titles. It's like, well, you haven't engaged us. The reason TV shows want to do it this way is they want you to be hooked in the story before those titles cause you to go off and get your drink or your snack or whatever. And this time they gave us no time. But we've been criticizing the music or critiquing the music, Tommy. I I did more analysis this time as it's got an opening of French horns, the transition into trumpets, then strings come in the second movement, and there's a final fanfare of brass.
Mhm.
And I really get hooked when the French horns transition to the trumpets. How about you?
Oh yeah. I think the music's I'm a fan of the music at this point. I wasn't so sure in the first episode or two, but I'm definitely hooked on it. I think whenever I hear it, I will think of the show for sure in some way, good or bad. Um, but yeah, no, I enjoy it, especially the trumpets because I used to play trumpet, so of course I'm a
Well, there you
big
go.
fan of that.
And every one of our viewers is saying, Toady, stick to the history and stop being a music critic because you suck at it. And you are right. Okay. These guys are talking, the Tuskegee Airmen, as they will become known, are saying in June of 44, they've already flown 500 missions. Is that right?
Roughly, yeah. I mean, I don't know the
Is that
exact
okay?
number of missions they'd flown at this point, but they had been flying for a while, yeah. So,
Mhm.
and contrary to popular belief, the vast majority of their combat missions were not bomber escort. Of course, that's what, has been permeated through the ether of inaccurate history, is that the vast majority of their missions were ground attack, fighter
Mhm.
sweeps, that kind of thing. Of course, they
Rockets,
escorted
bombs,
bombers. Yeah,
strafing.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
and which is what you see in this episode. And of course, they do escort
you
bombers.
do.
There's, obviously, but that is not what they were actually. That's not what they did more often than not. I'll just say that.
And these
Especially
guys are
early
based
on.
out of Italy. We flew bombers out of Italy too. That was
Oh yeah,
the Catch 22 was a bomber base out of Italy, as I recall. I read the book long before I saw the movie. Joseph Heller, as I recall, the great book, by the way. So yeah, we did a lot of operations out of Italy after we took it. They're talking about there's a line, and I know that the writer is so proud of this line, and they're talking to one of the pilots named Alex, and he says, "You're a clever fellow, Alex, but don't let smart be the enemy of happy." That writer went home happy that day after he wrote that line. Don't let smart be the enemy of happy. What did you think of that?
I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I think there's at the beginning of this episode, there's a lot of tropes that are in this episode so far.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot of stuff that kind of made me. I don't want to say became eye rollers to me, but it felt like I was watching a rerun of something that I'd seen before. So far,
Mhm.
and so far as some of the conversations that were being had, and so far as some of the attitudes that were being purveyed on screen, or portrayed, not purveyed. Sorry, guys, it's been a long day. Portrayed on screen,
Mhm.
that I felt like I'd seen these kind of things before because, well, you have. So, but that's
Yeah, I mean
neither
it
here nor there.
was to me very similar to the old HBO. I say old because it's been out for quite a while now. The Tuskegee Airmen project that HBO put out years ago, and
Which
even
was
into
good, by the way.
yeah, that was actually really good. Then there's the debacle of Red Tails, one of the worst World War II or military movies ever made, in my opinion, right up there with,
Agreed.
well, I'll get into that later. But
Pearl Harbor.
well, I was gonna say Pearl Harbor or Thin Red Line or others,
Mhm.
but I had to stop and think of the actual name. I didn't want to use the nickname of that movie. But I think there's a lot of similarities, and I think you know I got comments I can make later about some of the tropes and some of the race relation and related lines that they were kind of putting together at the very beginning, um, as we talk about the format of this episode and other things too.
Mhm. These guys seem to be wearing a different uniform than the airmen in England. Is that accurate as well?
Yeah, yeah, because they're in a tropical environment in the Mediterranean. Even though, I mean, parts of it are obviously, I guess, but you're an Italian, Bill. You can comment on that. But
It's
but
it's
in all
it's hot in
seriousness,
summer, I'll say
yeah,
that.
yeah. In all seriousness, the MTO, the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, yeah, it warranted different uniforms. It warranted different aspects of dress. Yet there's the ubiquitous A2 leather flying jacket that you see every single American Army Air Force, well, not every, but most Army Air Forces pilots, crewmen, whatever, wearing if they could, which was more often than not. Because again, even if it's 95 degrees on the ground, it's going to be damn cold at 12, 15,000 feet. So, you know,
Yep. Good. All right. Well, we cut to the Stalag, and we're going to talk about character arcs here throughout this episode. And which character arcs are generally good. You want to see characters evolve. You don't want them to be static. We just used that word in the last episode we recorded. In this case, they're trying to work Bucky into this character arc where his personality is changing. He's reenacting a baseball game by himself. And Buck walks up to him and says, "You okay, Major?" I'm sorry. I didn't know Bucky for real. Like, I didn't know him as a person, but I'm not buying this character arc, this trajectory that his character is on. It doesn't feel genuine to me. He's
And
getting a little bit more distant. I forgive him that, but he doesn't seem like a real person anymore. Guys, you know
yeah,
anything about this?
I think, and I don't know for sure. Of course, he's been dead quite a while and did get the chance to write his own
Mm,
story or anything. But I got to think everybody deals with some mental anguish, mental stress, whatever else. But I kind of feel like this was something they were more using based on other stories they heard, kind of a composite type of thing that they threw into his character to show the cracks of boredom. And, I think at some point he mentions he'd been there 8 months, which I find it interesting
correct.
that they still have the same faces, same hairdos, everything's the same 8 months later, no facial hair, no beards, whatever. But apparently they got a
Mm,
really good barber there at the POW camp. But um, yeah, I think it's just sort of, I think they're using this personally to show that some guys cracked. Now, I don't know that he did or that he did to the level of what they show in the series, but even, as we see later where they get into kind of locking horns with one another as guys will do in camps. I mean, it's a
mm,
stressful situation. You're all stuck, you're all bored, trying to do anything from reading to teaching classes to whatever to keep your sanity while also, you know, trying to survive in every way possible. Yeah,
mm.
you're going to have some moments there where you have some severe anxiety or lose it a little bit here and there, but I don't know that to the level. And for him to be the one to do it in the series was the right thing. I kind of felt like they could have used any of the other airmen who were right there in that POW camp and still had that same engagement, and it maybe been more effective.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
can
will.
go, Seth.
I was going to say, I will say this insofar as I agree with you 100%, Tommy, is that like, as far as the progression, physical progression of these characters, there is none. There's only one. And by that, I mean, these guys wouldn't have been the same weight. They'd have been significantly thinner. I don't expect these
Mhm.
actors to drop 50 pounds. Nobody does. But they don't look any different. There's only one time that I noticed when Clevin walks up to Egan in his fake baseball game. Clevin's eyes are very dark. It almost looks like he's gotten
Mm,
in a fight and he got punched in both eyes.
Mhm.
I don't think he did. What that is, and this is a thing, is that what that is that that's a vitamin deficiency, and that's from you not getting the
mhm.
proper amount of nutrition. Yet, if I memory serves me, and I watched this Sunday night, he's the only one that exhibits that. When in
That's
reality,
right.
everybody, with the exception of the new arrivals, would have looked like that or worse.
Yeah. Of
And
Mhm.
course,
because
he
I
still
think
has perfect
Tommy,
hair too, though. So.
well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, and of course,
I'm a
and they
charter
look
member of that
robust.
club,
And
but
they have a, but again, Bucky used to always be the life of the party, and Buck a little more stoic. Now Bucky is stoic, and Buck is trying to lift up spirits. They talked about escaping, and it could be worse. We could be dead. Um, and Buck is telling Bucky we have to be patient. And so that's kind of a interesting, very short segment in the POW camp before we cut to Crosby. And it's 3 days to D-Day. He hasn't slept for 72 hours. Bomb the German. The mission is to bomb the German defenses in Normandy before the landing, then bomb the responding German forces that are going to oppose the landing. He's having to plan 200 missions total. All that seems realistic to me, guys.
yeah, and it is. And Tommy actually was before earlier this morning. He was standing here in my office thumbing through Crosby's book, and it's actually a little more than that. Um,
Mm,
he was up for 75 hours,
Mhm.
which, and when you're up that long, every single minute counts. And then on top of that, it was more missions than that, than he says. I forget what the exact numbers. Do you remember what it was when you read it this morning?
I don't remember. Most of what I was looking for is what comes after all of this.
Regardless,
mhm.
regardless,
Yeah,
it was actually in reality, it was a little bit more than what they show
it was several
in
hundred
the
for sure.
show. Oh yeah, for sure, for
Yeah,
sure, yeah.
yeah.
And he's doing this.
It does.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say he's
I was
doing
going to
this
say,
all day long too.
yeah, yeah. And he goes to the dock and he's taking what we today call go pills, which in those days they would have been amphetamines. By the way, that still happens. We have when you're in actual combat, it's not uncommon to take go pills and what are now today called no-go pills, which are Ambien to go down. Because after you've taken a bunch of go pills and you're all hopped up on amphetamine, you've got to get something to force you to go to sleep, and that's Ambien. And if you're going to say that's very unhealthy, so is combat, folks. And so, yeah, I mean, it beats getting killed and shot down, and things like that.
Yeah.
So, I look back, and sure enough, I thought this was a modern invention. I know we did it in the Gulf War and Desert Storm, and in the post 9/11 world, we did this kind of thing. But I looked back in World War II, sure enough, they were giving them what we call today go pills. I don't
Yeah.
think they probably called them pep pills.
Well, the Germans actually did the same thing as well. There's a great book called Blitzed, if I remember correctly, where they even
Yep.
talk about all of the drugs they were using and using for combat, and even the addictions that came out of that. And but take it back to Crosby. That's part of what I was actually looking at when I was in Seth's office this morning, borrowing his copy of Winging a Prayer. Is there's no reference that Crosby actually took those. And the upcoming story is slightly different in what actually happened as well.
Okay, very interesting. Well, then they cut to Sandra, his, shall we say, beau, not his wife, who's undercover in Paris. Go figure. We knew that there was something spooky about her behavior. Now we know what it is. She's an agent, but it's a very brief,
It's
scene where
crap. Let me just say it's crap.
exactly.
Yeah,
The
it's
whole There's
malarkey. Yeah.
no actual proof that has been able to. I've looked around online. I've seen other people comment online. They can find no proof that Landra, if I remember correctly, it was her real name,
Landra.
was actually a
Mhm.
spy. This was a whole throwaway story arc to me that was useless in this entire episode. Made no sense. It was dumb. The whole thing was
Right.
dumb. They didn't even revisit it later on in the episode. I mean, you see the behind the scenes stuff when she's meeting with other Brits or whatever, and they say they have another mission forward. The whole thing is just throwaway, and I don't understand if this is supposed to be a series about the 100th Bomb Group. Why are we spending so much time on Crosby's side piece and on his affair and on this lady that may or may not be a spy in real life? Um, I don't know. I just thought the whole thing was useless for this episode. There could have been so many other things they did with the time they show her in here. Sorry to be blunt, but it's just
No,
it
it's
Yeah.
true
is
though.
it's the only I don't know. There's no need for it.
So, last week we said it was the worst episode yet. I'm not going to tell you that this was the worse than that, but to use the Airedale metaphor, this series seems to be in a tailspin. Um,
The
I
the
same
agree.
director as last week, by the way, too, Bill. This episode
Yeah,
and last week's for sure are
in
the
last
same
week's,
different episodes altogether from the previous and a whole different director for
but they're
both
doing
as
the
well.
music video. They're doing the music video thing again with 30-second or 1 minute scenes. So Sandra's in Paris. Then they cut back 60 hours, cut back to Crosby. So 60 hours, your mind starts playing tricks on you and he hears ticking from a
Yeah.
clock that's not there. Then they cut back to Sandra in Paris and she's unloading a bunch of photograph film that of the place that she spied on, that she's taken pictures of, and they tell her, you leave tomorrow. Then they cut back to Crosby, 64 hours, try to survive, breath by breath, step by step. There's action, there's activity without progress. The story is not being moved forward. It's just cutting back from nonsense to nonsense, in my view.
Yeah, the
It's full.
propellers have fallen off the airplane or the wheels have come off. However, like you said, it's in a tailspin, in
Yeah,
my
yeah.
opinion.
It's
Go ahead,
it's
Seth. Sorry.
foolishness. It's foolishness is what it is. And it's like I'll be honest with you, I feel like it's like a 10-year-old writing this story because and it's unnecessarily so because if you actually wanted to focus on what the 100th bomb group, which if I remember correctly, is the actual subject of this series, or at least it's supposed to be,
It's
if you
supposed to
focus
be.
on the 100th bomb group and what they did in that early part of the Normandy campaign, specifically D-Day, there's a lot of really dramatic stuff that happens there. And the fact is that there's a lot of guys in the air. There's a lot of really bad things that happen on the ground as a result, not necessarily the 100th Bomb Group, but of the 8th Air Force as a whole, as they, hey, just spoiler alert, as we like to say, we bomb our own people
Yeah.
with B-17s, not with a P-47, with
And don't
a whole,
forget, flying some of these at night, which the whole first half of the Dadgum series, they talked about the British flying at night.
yeah.
And then you got bombers, C-47s, P-51s, P-47s, everything starting to fly before it's even dawn yet. And I remember, like, I think Clayton Kelly Gross was one of them that flew with the 354th, saying it was so dark outside that after they took off and formed up, the only thing you could see were basically flares or flashes of fire coming from the engines of the aircraft around you. And that's what you sort of formed up on and tried to get as tight as you could safely flying those missions for June 6th. And you're right, Seth. I think they should have shown way more. They could have spent way more time with Rosenthal or with the 100th in preparation for and execution of D-Day,
Yep.
and less on Sandra, Landra, whatever, farting around in Paris or wherever she was at.
You spend the entire part of the first portion of the series working up to this. The reason that the 8th Air Force was in England in the first place was to clear the skies to allow this
Or
very
this.
day, yes, for
Yeah.
this day to occur. And then you don't even cover it. You cover it with a fart, and it's ridiculous. And you're,
Yeah.
as you said, you're too busy chasing after Landra Sandra in Paris with something that did not occur.
Yeah.
Well, good segue because we're now to D-Day. We've got a new CO named Jeffrey.
Yep.
Rosie says the station is on full lockdown, few hours away from the invasion of Europe. Great cheering. They're suiting up. And somebody says to Rosie, "Do you have any last words of wisdom?" And he says, "Last words? No, because we're going to be back. Take off, do your job, land. Then you're going to be giving me some words of wisdom," which is actually not a bad line.
No, it's not. And the new CEO that comes in is a guy named Thomas Jeffries, who would be, again, I think we said this last week or the week before. The 100th was one of those units that was favored by having outstanding commanding officers. Once Harding gets in, and everybody that follows him is really just outstanding. And Jeffries is probably the best of all of them. He really is. He's probably the best commander that the 100th had throughout the entire war, because he really forms the 100th, and it's him really forms the 100th into, when they come over from the United States in the beginning, they're a ragtag kind of devil may care. They got a bad rep. And then Harding sees them through the black days of October 43 and beyond a little bit. And then, Jeffries comes in and he takes command, and he takes the 100th and forms them into an outstanding professional unit that becomes one of the better units in the 8th Air Force because of his leadership. So he's legit. He's the real deal, or was. Yep. God bless him.
Okay.
Well, and something I wanted to throw into this too is you see this mission, it's also not lost to me, and I did mention that to Seth when I was in his office this morning. They had that important line when Rosie's considering going home, or trying to consider whether he's going home or staying. And the commander's like, "Look, just so you know, we're getting ready to start taking these B-17s up to make them bait for the fighters." It's this very throwaway kind of conversation, but extremely important to the war, to the doctrine of what the Air Force is doing. And yet we've seen nothing since then about any of that. Not in preparation for D-Day. There's nothing. We spend more time with Crosby and Landra and the bed than we do showing other missions or showing instances with how different the war is and how that change came about, or maybe how few fighters they're seeing on some missions versus others, or whatever. But you don't have it. We went entire, 2 episodes so far. We've had very little to no combat at all. And this whole show is supposed to be about an aerial unit. It's kind of interesting, but I do think that's a lost opportunity where they could have made that line have more meaning and explained a little bit more history in the series in a way of showing some of that actually happening and less of what they were actually showing.
Agreed. And the fundamental defect is they're trying to tell too many stories and they're not doing any of them well.
Yep.
And so to your point, they set you up by saying you're going to be bait. and then they never show one mission where you're bait.
Right.
Why do that? And now
Yeah.
we're on D-Day. Okay, so now we're back to the Stalag again. These silly cuts to try to cram everything in there, and they're pulling up a tree stump. And the story is that they're trying to get wood for cook fires. Bucky seems to be losing it. He ends up getting in a wrestling match with Buck. Ends up punching him. The Germans start shouting. They said the Germans got some bad news. It must mean that we've landed in Europe, right?
Yeah.
Every time the Germans shout, they think that we've landed in Europe, apparently. And immediately we cut to the Tuskegee Airmen again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is kind of
It's very frenetic. It's very frenetic or very schizophrenic is the word that comes to mind. It's like, I don't know what story to tell. So I'm going to tell all of them,
right.
but none of them
Let's
will.
tell all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the Tuskegee Airmen, to your point, Seth, it's like every war movie you've ever seen where the Tuskegee Airmen are showing their girlfriends' pictures to each
Yeah.
other. I mean, how on the nose can you possibly get? They cut to Munich now after the one shot of them showing pictures of their girlfriends. Now, they're on to Munich. We're going to look around this room. Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry. This is still with the Tuskegee Airmen. They say we're on our way to Munich, and he says, "Look around this room. See what I see? Proud pilots who flew their first mission to Germany." And there's a long discussion about, the fact that they're second lieutenants who should be first lieutenants and first lieutenants who should be captains because we're required to play by different rules. Now, I have to assume that was true, guys, that their promotion rates was slower. Was it?
Mm, technically, no, because I
Really?
mean, the commanding officer of the 332nd, a guy named Benjamin Davis, was a full
Junior.
bird colonel. Junior was a full bird colonel, just like any other commanding officer, a fighter squadron or fighter group or a bomber group. His dad, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., was a general, and he was the first African American graduate of the school on the Hudson, West Point. So, to that end, there were guys that maybe should have gotten promotions earlier, maybe so. But you could say that in any unit.
Mhm.
Were they replete with first lieutenants and no captains? No, malarkey. It's baloney. The promotion rate within the 332nd Fighter Group was no less than in any other group, period, bar none. So, there's a lot of myths out there about the 332nd that have been perpetuated by society, which are wrong. Tommy, pull the book up.
Well, I will. Give me another motion or point I want to bring up too. You talked about earlier the P-40s, and they made some throwaway comment about inferior something hard to, and ironically, they probably had some of the best and newest P-40s when they were assigned them, even better than North Africa and other places too. But yeah, there's a great book that actually will. I don't know if it's going to show up
Pull
backwards
it
or
back a little
not,
bit.
but
Pull it back.
yeah, sorry.
Yep, we
Dan
could see it.
Hallman's Misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. Great book. You can get it on Amazon. It's also electronic copies on there too. And it gets into even some that some that I knew were misconceptions and some I didn't. And he actually gives great footnotes in there and did a ton of research at Maxwell and others on um, whether or not there's whole stories about the great train robbery where they had to rob a train to get their own equipment, and just tons of other stuff that were perpetuated either at the time or since the war. But great book if you get the chance to pick it up, and it doesn't do any. It's not a. I want to say outright, it's not bashing the Tuskegee Airmen by any means. It's
Not at all.
bashing
Mhm.
the myths that have been perpetuated, not even by most of those guys. Um, it's just media or whoever, movies over the years, Red Tails, um, George Lucas, things in there that are actually really, really cool that I wish I had known or known some of these men earlier than I did just to be able to talk to them even more about some of this stuff.
Mhm. Yep. Okay, so we're back to Rosie. The last time we saw him, he was flat on his face because his go pills ran out and he passed out, boom,
Crosby.
slam.
Crosby,
Um,
Crosby, you mean?
Crosby, sorry,
Yeah.
Crosby. And Rosie, yeah, to cut back more, sorry, Crosby. And so he wakes up, there's somebody sitting with him and says, "What do I miss?" And He's been asleep for 3 days.
So
And again,
that's the part that I had to look up. So
okay.
what actually happens, he does again, there's no record of him taking any of the uppers or amphetamines or whatever. He drinks tons of hot coffee to stay awake. I think hot so that it, burns his throat, wakes him up, but also the caffeine. And then there is a conversation that's really well done in the series where they're having to order him to get sleep. And they show
Mhm.
that, really well in there where they're saying, Crosby, you need to go hit the sack and
Mhm.
order him to do so. He stands up, falls out. In reality, and I wish they had done it this way, he climbs in a Jeep and almost runs into a tree, which of course we talked about in a previous episode with being in an aircraft that runs into a tree. So kind of feel like it would have been humorous to do it the right way, really, and tie it into this whole tree thing. But yeah, he actually gets in a Jeep, drives towards his bunk or his barracks, almost runs into a tree, ends up falling asleep with his clothes on. I think I remember reading his shoes were
Shoes
still
are
on,
on.
his
Yeah.
tie, everything. He's still in uniform, and he only sleeps for a 24-hour period, basically. They say 3 days in the series. No, he was
Mhm.
awake for 3 or 75 hours, but he was actually completely out, probably borderline comatose for 24 hours straight, and then wakes up, is what, according to Crosby from his own words and Winging a Prayer.
Yep. And somebody's witnessing to him that during the landing D-Day, which they don't show except for a little throwaway shot, there were hundreds of ships, thousands of men. We hit the comm centers, not a single fighter. I can't believe, and Crosby says, I can't believe I missed it. Did he miss it?
Yeah.
Was he
He
asleep?
did.
Was
Yes.
that during?
Yeah. He
Yeah, he
definitely
did.
slept through it.
Okay. All right. So now we're back at the Stalag, 2 months after D-Day. So they jump ahead. And again, they're listening to the radio, Stalag 17 style, or is it Stalag 19, Hogan's Heroes style. And
Not like
I
17. Yeah.
guess those radios did exist, guys, huh?
Oh yeah. Heck yeah.
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 Absolutely. Yeah.
So, and what he's able to discern from the radio reports is that the Allies are less than 450 miles away from their POW camp. And I guess this is what they're leading to, the exposition and the revealing. We're probably gonna see that the Allies come close to them and the Germans end up having to move them. But I'm guessing that's where this is going. And they're talking about the need to make more weapons because the Germans may move us deeper into Germany, Bavaria, for example, because they could use prisoners of war for leverage.
Mhm.
Do we have
That,
indications that that was happening?
that was a very real fear. And to
Mhm.
answer what you posed as, at least I think it was a question, is that yes, the Germans do move them out of Eastern Europe and they move them into closer, deeper in, excuse me, into the Reich, into Bavaria. um, there was a very real fear among Allied prisoners of war that the Germans, as the closer the Allies got to them, specifically the Soviets, that the Germans were going to execute them all. Because there were
Mhm.
certain camps at this point that were under SS control and Gestapo control, and those guys didn't give a rat's ass. They'd have killed their mothers if they'd have had to. But there was a very real fear, and what they show in this episode is, frankly, the best part of the episode is these guys, our guys, Clevin and the crew, preparing to deal with that if they have to. And that is
Mhm.
100% accurate. Yes, there was a real fear. There were Allied POWs, we're talking about Americans here, that did that very thing. You know,
Mhm.
made clandestine weapons and had plans on how to kill, and not that they really needed that information, but what to do if the defecation hits the ventilation, as Mike Mervosh used to say, and things like that. So I mean, it's like this was a real thing. This was a real fear. They were preparing for the absolute worst.
Yeah. Well, guys, here we cut back to the Tuskegee Airmen in what I consider the most egregious scene in this entire 8 episodes so far. And I'll see, hear me out for a second. So they're briefing these runs. They're going to go into Germany at the far extent of their, uh, if you listen to them talk, further than what their planes, the range the planes have, even with drop tanks. And one of the pilots stands up and he does math in public. And he talks as if He's the only one who can figure out that this mission is 200 miles beyond what the airplane is capable of, even with drop tanks. And that's borderline offensive to me because every one of those pilots would have known about that, would have had that math all worked out. Everybody who's being briefed on this mission, not the one smart guy, would have, would have made an issue of that, would have had it figured out. And it's like this guy is revealing to the entire group of assembled pilots how risky this mission is going to be. That's just really bad storytelling. And frankly, it makes all the rest of them look like they didn't know how to fly their planes. So that I couldn't remain silent for.
And I
You
think
know,
in real life, he was a mathematician. And so I think they were trying to
Mhm.
work that into his story arc a little bit. I think the other part of that is personally, I think they were trying to also show that the Tuskegee Airmen weren't idiots. And there was this concept, of course, even in the 1940s, they were too stupid or dumb to fly and all this other stuff. So I kind of feel like maybe some of that, that's just my guess, is the director or folks working on the project kind of wanted to show intelligence in the room, or but I do think it kind of backfired in a way that does seem like the rest of them are sort of stupid and hadn't worked this out for themselves. So
You want to supply this mission? Okay. And only
yeah,
one guy knows what the heck's going on. Seth?
so
yeah,
and therein lies the problem. First of all, if you're going to strap yourself into an airplane, be it a fighter or a bomber or whatever, I don't care if you're flying from here to Munich or from Ramitelli to Munich or from Ramitelli to freaking, the village next door. There is the chance that you are going to die. Yes, some missions are a little more risky than others. Obviously, we know that. But there's always the chance that you are going to die. So they're trying to amp up the drama with this. I think they're
Mhm.
trying to say, oh, we're going to send the 332nd out farther, blah, 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 and all this other malarkey. It just doesn't work. And then to your point, Tommy, about trying to show these guys to be intelligent. Of course they're intelligent. They're pilots.
Mhm.
You can't
mhm,
be a yokel. This isn't the movie Pearl Harbor where you have a near illiterate trying to fly a P-40 in the skies over Pearl Harbor. These are professional aviators. These are officers. They're professional combat troops. These guys are there for a reason. They are there because they're good at what they do. They're highly intelligent and they're combat professionals. So I think they're trying to undercut our knowledge or our appreciation of these guys, which I think is unnecessary completely because these guys,
Yeah,
they're no different than guys in the 357th flying out of England. They're doing the same
that's my
damn
point.
thing. Yeah, no, I
Every
agree.
one of
I'm
them,
agreeing with you. Yeah.
yeah, every one of them would have understood what the guy, what
Heck
I think
yeah.
was his name, was Brooke.
Heck yeah.
They would have done the math, know what the range is, what the range limits are, even with the drop tank. And it's just like they look like it's just one guy who knows what's going on. It just
Yeah.
that was not good. So, and to your point, they, I, they show three guys getting shot down in very short order. Um, and several of them bailing out. One of them was completely realistic. His plane is in a very rapid spin,
Hmm.
and this scene shot is the most cartoonish shot we've seen from an animation standpoint in the entire series, where a guy bails out of the spinning airplane. There would be no way he'd be pinned to the side of the aircraft. It was spinning that quickly. He could not have gotten out. It looked like a cartoon, a comic book movie at that point, which I really, really regret because these guys were real heroes. We don't need to turn them into cartoon characters.
I
And two of
agree.
them were captured by Germans. Was it three?
three.
Three, three
Three.
total. No, I agree. And I mean, the 332nd Fighter Group, which is how they were called, by the way, Tuskegee Airmen, something that was formulated after the war. But the 332nd were an exceptional bunch of human beings. They really were. I knew many of them, as did you, Tommy. And there is no need to amp up the heroics. If you tell the story accurately and you want to tell the story of the 332nd, which I implore you to do in an accurate manner, because the one that was made by HBO, I don't know, however many years ago, was pretty
30,
good.
40 years ago. Yeah, it was a while
Red
ago.
Tails is trash. And since then, there hasn't been really anything at all that has told the story of the 332nd in a respectful, number one, and accurate, number two, way. You ain't going to
Right.
do that in the second to last episode of this series. You want to do something on the 332nd, and you should do something that focuses on them, be it its own series or its own movie or something, or I don't know,
Spin-off from this
whatever.
even. I
Yeah,
mean,
whatever.
that was part of
It could do
my
that.
comments I was saving
Mhm.
for closing was that, there's too many story arcs, too much jumping around and meandering in this episode and the previous episode. They're so throwaway now, sadly.
Mhm.
It's hard to keep up with characters. They do a great
Yeah.
job with Alexander Jefferson. I got to know him, by the way. And last time I saw him actually was at Oshkosh watching P-51s and P-47s fly, which was cool. But they do a really good job on his character, I will say. But to me, make it a spinoff to give them some more justice in how you're telling their story because they don't even cover anything with their training. If you want to do this and cover even race relations, they have a few throwaway lines or implications, but you don't even get a good shot of that. The
Mhm.
thing they were known for, which they weren't the only ones, was flying in tight formations with the bombers. That actually came about, I think,
Mhm.
before the Tuskegee Airmen, but it was something they became known for. You don't even see it. You don't see it in this episode.
Right.
You don't see it, in my opinion, Masters of the Air, they have perpetuated and promoted this to be the story of the 100th Bomb Group. So in my opinion, they should have just stuck with that, or if you're going to make it Masters of the Air and make it about a bunch of different aviation experiences and multiple Masters of the Air in their professions, do it over several fighter groups, several bomber groups, and individuals all serving around the same time. Show some in training while some are in combat. That kind of thing is, I feel like they tried to sort of do that in the last few episodes, but started with a whole other objective initially, which was to focus on the 100th Bomb Group. And I think they've completely lost themselves by about episode 7. And it's
Yeah.
it's unfortunate. They spent so much time on so many other things with the Quinn and the other gentleman getting shot down, and they throw away their whole recovery and
Story of it. Yeah.
reintroduction. And again, they spend more time on Sandra or Landra or whatever, and miss a lot of opportunities where they could have introduced the Tuskegee even earlier. Think about it. If they'd have cut
Correct.
out Crosby's sexual relationships and started to introduce your Alexander Jefferson and other characters in there earlier in the series, this may have actually been a fairly decent episode. But because they waited so long, threw it all together and jumped around, I just feel like it wasn't. I don't know.
Yeah. One of our commenters early, like episode 2 or 3, was saying, "Oh, you guys are just fanboys." Um, so, folks, this episode was trash. So, and it doesn't do the heroes justice.
Mm-mm.
And so you call us fanboys now. We're just calling it the way we see it. And that's
Sure.
my opinion.
I
You
did like
guys
the
may
Mustang
differ.
footage, I will say. It looked pretty realistic, like you said, when the spinning and the audio effects, everything else. I actually watched it with headphones when I watched it the other night because the kids were
Hmm.
asleep in the next room. But the sights, the sounds, everything else. But I thought, where was this several episodes ago, or why wait until the next to last episode to do
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
and not cover too, your only Medal of Honor fighter pilot in Europe, Jim Howard. They made such
Mhm.
an effort when they made the Pacific to include Basilone, a Medal of Honor recipient. Why couldn't you do some stuff with his story within Masters of the Air too, or Gabby Gabreski, or Bud Anderson, or some of these others as well? Whether you keep the Tuskegee in or not, I don't care. But I'm just saying, like, why are they the only fighter pilots that we see in the entire series? But
Yep.
yeah, I just feel like this could have been better thought out in the way that they sort of storyboarded all of this early on.
Mhm.
There's just too much,
Too
especially in
much
the
going
direction
on.
of this episode. Yeah, jumping back and forth with them, POW camps and all that was too busy.
Speaking of that, we're back in the Stalag, and the idea comes that they've got to get stronger so they could fight back for when they're liberated, or when they have the opportunity to escape or whatever. And so they decide, here's a great plot point. Let's use that stump remover to build up strength. Because if we start lifting weights, the Germans will get suspicious. But if we have people rotate on the stump remover, they won't get suspicious. We'll just tell them we're after extra wood for the winter. Give me a break.
Agreed.
You got to waste time on that?
Yeah, agreed. Because I mean, it was the Germans didn't give a damn if somebody was lifting weights. They didn't care. They
Or
could have
doing
cared
PT,
less.
yeah.
Yeah, they did not care. They encouraged physical activity, as a matter of fact.
Mm,
They did not care. So that is your typical comic book throwaway piece of garbage line. And I agree. I mean, the first, several episodes of this series have been very good, very good.
mm,
And then the last two by this director, which has done these last two, have just been, you know, whatever, man.
mm.
Very disappointing.
So now they show the captured Tuskegee Airmen in a German POW camp. The German interrogator gives him a cigarette. He knows all about his father's job. We talked about that before, that the Germans really did have spies in the United States. They could do it. He says, "You're an engineer, and you could get a job in an American lab cleaning toilets." Now, there's some truth in that line.
Sure, for
Um,
sure. Yeah.
but the Americans were true to form, name, rank, serial number. He's trying to tell him how much he knows about Paradise Valley in Detroit. Where are you blacks forced to live in LA and Watts? I know about Watts and things like that. I'm not sure that was actually true in 1943 yet, was it?
I mean,
I don't know for
it's
sure. I know some of the Germans had been in America before the war, and so they were
Mhm. Yeah,
familiar, whether they had spies or not. You gotta remember some of these guys had been to Detroit and LA and Dallas and a bunch of different cities, so they knew neighborhoods or knew the right terminology to mess with some of us.
we're back. They moved the African Americans to the same camp that Buck and Bucky are in. Um, and guys start saying, "Oh, you're from the Red Tails. What are you doing here? You saved our asses so many times. Come on, we'll get you fixed up." And coming into the barracks with Buck, um, actually not a bad line where when later one of the African Americans asked Buck, "Why didn't you?" Mouth off when you saw us coming into your barracks. Buck says, "Well, at least we knew you weren't a spy."
yeah,
I thought that was a great line.
it was. It was.
It was a, a high point in an otherwise pretty low episode. So now Sandra Orlandra not available. She is now Captain Westgate. Crosby's been given a month leave. He's going to go back to New York and he wants to connect with her one last time, and she's not there. What the heck? You just wasted a minute on that. And so we're back to the Stalag. Um, we're talking about the African Americans are talking about a way to break out where they could pretend that they're the POWs being all we need is two of these white boys to get in Nazi uniforms and drive us out in that truck right there. And again, yes, conversations like that might have happened, but you're not moving the story forward. You're not providing us anything that helps us understand the heroic circumstances of this war and these men.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I didn't appreciate the conversation because I thought it was completely fabricated. I mean,
Mhm.
the first thing on every single prisoner of war's mind is to get the hell out of there. And then after that, when
Sure.
they realize they ain't getting out of there, their second thing is they're thinking about food. And
Mhm.
to the timeline of this episode, yeah, these guys are wanting to get out of there, but who the hell ain't? And I just feel that it was contrived. It was very contrived. It was very weak, as so far
Mhm.
everything with this past two episodes has been. So, but that's just me.
Mhm. And one of the guys he can draw and
Yeah,
he's drawing
Jefferson.
maps and
That was
Jefferson.
Jefferson,
Jefferson.
yeah. He was
Yeah.
if you get the chance, he actually put out a book not long before he passed of his memoirs, and I think there's some of his artwork in there. He's a beautiful artist, and really that
Mhm.
is they did a good job capturing his no pun intended, his talents and skills and who he was as an individual character. I just hate that they did it in episode 7 and didn't do something earlier,
8.
or again a side project or something, or 8, sorry, yeah, 8,
Episode 8.
and didn't
Yeah.
do it as a you know something where they could have fleshed out his character and others even more so.
Mhm. And of course, the closing scene, or almost the penultimate scene, the second from the end, is Crosby again trying to meet Sandra Landra or whoever she
Sandra Landra.
is. He's like, come on.
Westgate,
And then
Wingate, yeah.
yeah, back to the Stalag where they talk about the radio East German planning, training, working, and for what they hope is going to be the opportunity to get out. And somebody says, speaking of the Allies, they're close, really, really close. And that's kind of how the episode ends. Guys, wrapping it up. Summary, Seth?
I thought it sucked. I'll be honest with you. Straight, I mean, cut to the chase, sledgehammer to the face. I mean, I really, I didn't mean that, mean for that to rhyme, but yeah, I mean, I thought it was weak. There's 25 different storylines you're trying to tell here, and you're not telling any of them with any degree of accuracy. Well, I don't want to say accuracy, but any degree of detail that's necessary to actually explain said things. Um, I just there's so much that you could have done here and still stayed within the
Mhm.
story arc. Again, I don't care. You want to talk about the 332nd? Knock yourself out. They deserve their own attention. They do. However, stick with the storyline that you've tried to create for the past 7 episodes and stick with the people that you need to. You should not, I agree with you 100%, Tommy. Don't introduce these guys in the second to last episode of a 9-part series. I think I don't know. I didn't like it. And it's unfortunate because the first 6 mostly were very, very good. And these last 2 have just been
Mhm.
stinkers, man. They really have. I'm hoping,
Yep.
I'm hoping that the last one redeems the rest of the series. I really do.
Yep. Tommy?
I agree with what Seth said. I think this series, I really think it's lost its way. I
Mhm.
think it started off episode 1 through 6 as a strong drama, melodrama of a great bomb group. Again, all the advertising up to this talked about 100 bomb group, 100 bomb group. To me, it was a little crazy seeing they put the Tuskegee Airmen in. I mean, I get it. I get why they did it. I think they could have done a whole other spin-off and added to this series and perpetuated it even further and grown it in popularity even more. But to cram it in episode 8 seemed a little bit, or not a little bit, a lot rushed. And too much jumping in this. The other thing that frustrates me with the show is that I like that they've used Crosby as the main narrator throughout
Sure.
this because he's been there for most everything and was there for so friggin' long. But they've spent half the time on his character with him and this girlfriend of his that it's such a loss in his own story or in his own service
Mhm.
and how great he was with what he did. Um, and then the same thing with Rosie. He's still one of my aviation legendary heroes of all time up there. And they've made him a bit character. I know he's going to have a bigger presence in this last episode, but I mean, in the last 2 episodes, he's really not been a major player. We see him fly this one awesome mission, and then we hear this conversation about him staying, and then you completely lose him. To me, he's equal to Buck and Bucky as far as the
Mhm.
Should be.
story arc and all of this, and should be, yeah. But they've sort of made he and Crosby both sort of just B B roll type or B
Bit role.
characters in here instead of bit roll. Yeah, there's the word I'm looking for. Sorry, it's like second Monday for me, but um, they could have made him a much stronger presence in this series than they have, and I think they've wasted a lot of time that they could have used on Rosie Rosenthal and telling more of the war and the air war, especially after Buck and Bucky are shot down and through D-Day and beyond to show that the air war still goes on, believe it or not, even though we really haven't seen much of it the last 2 episodes.
Mhm.
I think they've definitely missed a huge opportunity to make even more of a hero out of him like he deserves.
Yeah. So imagine if you're Crosby's grandkids
Mm.
and you watch this series and you're going to say, Grandpa's major contribution to the war was chasing a woman who isn't grandma. What's up with that? I mean, this is what this is the mate, regardless of what he really did in the war and the great book that he wrote. This is the main memory you're going to have of Crosby and Rosenthal, who, if there's a triumvirate of main characters in the story, if you want to make Buck and Bucky 2 of them, Rosenthal should be the third, or one of the Tuskegee Airmen, if you wanted to do that. That would be fine.
Mhm.
But this series has lost its way. And when you see the name of the great talents under the executive producer roles on this thing, Spielberg, Hanks. You wonder if they used their names to get this thing greenlit and then had nothing to do with it, because both those guys know how to tell a story, and this ain't it. This ain't how to tell a story. This is kind of a diluted mixture of a bunch of nothing, and they're stirring it together and thinking a relevant miniseries comes out of it that speaks to the heart of the sacrifice of World War II. This ain't that. And that's my opinion anyway.
Very true. And thinking back to my comments on Rosie, he could easily be, especially with Buck and Bucky at this point in the series, he could be and almost should be portrayed as Dick Winters was in Band of Brothers.
Correct.
I don't know. I don't see an iconic level and character and development, even with Buck and Bucky at this point in the POW camp. I mean, it's all just gotten kind of watered down. So,
yep. Oh, well, with that, Seth, I turn it back over to you.
Yeah, that's pretty much going to wrap it up. And well, next week will be the final review of this series. So we'll go through episode 9 next week, and I guess give our final thoughts on the entire series as a whole. Let's hold out hope that the final episode redeems what's been so far a pretty dang good series, with the exception of these last 2 episodes that have been just absolute bombs. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, look at our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Paradon. I want to thank you very much. Tommy, thank you again, as always, for being here with us this week. Always good to have you. And Bill, bring us home.
Bill Tody, see you again next week.